Masks at Windsor. The Windsor estate had always carried a strange duality, grand enough to impress any visitor yet intimate enough to remind us of family gatherings that stretched back generations. On that afternoon, when laughter from the gardens mixed with the echo of footsteps in the long corridors, I felt that duality unravel. It was here, in what should have been the safest of spaces, that Camilla's mask slipped, and once it did, there was no way to unsee it. Camilla's public mask was well rehearsed. She had spent decades perfecting it, the smile that softened her reputation, the carefully chosen words about duty, the warmth she projected at hospitals and schools. I had watched her lean in with apparent compassion when speaking to strangers, her voice dropping into that gentle, reassuring tone that seemed almost maternal. For years, the press, especially the BBC and the Times, had described this evolution as her quiet triumph, her journey from vilified figure to accepted Queen Consort. But I always wondered how much of that triumph was genuine and how much was theater. At Windsor, I got my answer. William's son George had wandered into the corridor, clutching a book he'd been reading. What should have been a benign moment, a grandmotherly smile, a few kind words, took a turn none of us expected. Camilla's voice, sharp and clipped, carried through the hall. What she said pierced not only George but everyone who later heard about it. It was not the tone of affection but of dismissal, words that diminished rather than encouraged. I will not repeat them verbatim here, but they were words that cut at a child's sense of belonging, and they redrew the lines of trust within the family. The effect on George was immediate. His shoulders stiffened, his gaze dropped, and he retreated without a word. To see a future king's confidence shaken so quickly in the very halls meant to nurture him was deeply unsettling. William arrived moments later, his expression hardening as he pieced together what had happened. I watched the civility between him and Camilla collapse in real time. Whatever fragile balance they had maintained out of loyalty to Charles dissolved that day in Windsor. Looking back, I realized that the incident was not isolated. It was the culmination of long simmering tensions. Camilla's smile had always concealed more than it revealed. Her survival within the monarchy was built on endurance, not universal affection. Reuters once reported how her approval ratings, though improved, remained stubbornly lower than those of William and Catherine. The Guardian noted that younger generations in particular saw her not as a symbol of stability, but as a relic of the past tied forever to Diana's shadow. Against that backdrop, her words to George felt less like a slip and more like a symptom of deeper insecurity. The staff at Windsor knew it too. I could see it in their eyes, the horror of having witnessed a consort speak that way to a child of Diana's line. Their silence, trained by palace protocol, could not hide their dismay. And in that silence, I realized something fundamental had shifted. William's relationship with Camilla had always been strained, but Windsor was the breaking point. The mask had cracked, the civility was gone, and the fracture was now permanent. Masks are powerful in monarchy. They reassure the public, they steady the institution, they create the illusion of continuity. But when they slip in private, they reveal truths that no amount of spin can erase. At Windsor, I saw behind Camilla's mask. And what I saw made it clear trust once broken in such a way could never be rebuilt. Words to a child. I replay that corridor exchange in my mind again and again, each time hoping I misheard, each time arriving at the same conclusion. Camilla's words to George carried a weight no child should have to bear. It was not just what she said, but the way she said it, clipped, dismissive, layered with an authority that seemed to push him out rather than draw him in. Children are intuitive. They can sense when they are being diminished. And in that moment, George knew. His body language told the story before he ever spoke of it. Shoulders tense, book held tighter to his chest, his steps retreating with an almost silent dignity. I could see William's fury even before he spoke. He is protective of his children not only because they are heirs, but because they carry Diana's memory forward. For George, Charlotte, and Louis, every word directed at them is magnified by history. To be treated with warmth is to honor Diana's legacy. To be treated with coldness is to desecrate it. Camilla surely understood this, and yet whether out of frustration, miscalculation, or something deeper, she crossed that invisible line. The psychology of such moments is profound. Experts often note how children in royal households, despite their privilege, endure extraordinary pressure. They are raised under the scrutiny of the world, their every gesture dissected. What they need most within palace walls is sanctuary, a space where their identity is affirmed rather than questioned. Camilla's words achieved the opposite. They unsettled George in his own home, undermining the very sense of belonging the monarchy depends on for its continuity. Mainstream outlets have long tracked Camilla's delicate position within the family. The BBC once described her as accepted, though never adored. YouGov polling echoed the sentiment, showing that while her popularity rose slightly after the coronation, skepticism lingered, especially among younger Britons who still venerated Diana. Against this backdrop, her exchange with George seemed to confirm what critics had always feared, that her warmth was strategic, conditional, and brittle. I tried at first to rationalize it. Perhaps she was tired. Perhaps she intended a joke that landed poorly. Perhaps she underestimated how sharp her tone would feel to a child. But those excuses crumbled when I recalled the look in George's eyes. Children rarely misinterpret intent. They feel it instinctively. And George felt excluded, diminished, as though a door had been closed to him. The fallout was immediate. William ended contact with Camilla not with dramatic declarations, but with a silence colder than any words. Invitations were not extended. Phone calls went unanswered. Meetings were avoided. What had once been strained civility became deliberate distance. For him, protecting his son came before maintaining any veneer of unity. And for Camilla, the loss of William's cooperation marked a profound isolation within the family structure. International reporting sharpened the blow. Reuters ran analyses of the widening generational gap within the monarchy, noting how every misstep involving Diana's descendants amplified distrust. Al Jazeera emphasized the symbolic resonance that Camilla's words to a child carried echoes of unresolved tension stretching back decades. Even Deutsche Welle, in its typically measured tone, framed the incident as a reminder that Diana's shadow still defines public judgment. I could not shake the sense that this was more than a family quarrel. It was a defining moment in the monarchy's narrative. Camilla had worked for decades to rebuild her image, but a few words to a child had undone years of patient rehabilitation. In monarchy, symbolism is everything. To wound Diana's grandson, even in words, was to wound Diana's legacy. And no PR campaign, no charm offensive could ever erase that. As I watched George later that evening quietly reading his book in the corner, I realized the deeper truth: children may forgive, but they do not forget. And neither, it seemed, would William. Camilla's words had redrawn the boundaries forever, and Windsor would never feel the same. Charm, ambition, survival. For years, I had watched Camilla craft an image of resilience built brick by brick out of charm and sheer survival instinct. She had endured the vilification of the 90s, weathered the tabloid storms that painted her as the villain in Diana's tragedy, and re-emerged in the 21st century with a crown upon her head. The BBC once described her transformation as one of the most remarkable image rehabilitations in modern royal history. And yet Windsor revealed how fragile that transformation truly was. Her charm was never accidental. Every laugh at a public event, every moment captured with school children, every cause she championed: osteoporosis, research literacy programs, animal welfare, was carefully chosen. Reuters and The Guardian frequently pointed out that these were safe causes designed to present her as empathetic without inviting controversy. Her fashion choices mirrored this strategy: traditional, understated, deliberately avoiding the dazzling flair that had defined Diana. Ordinary was her shield, charm her weapon, and through those tools, she managed to survive. But survival is not the same as acceptance. Polling by YouGov consistently showed the limits of her rehabilitation. While older Britons grew more willing to tolerate her, younger generations never forgot Diana. For them, Camilla's charm could never outshine the memory of the Princess of Wales walking through minefields or embracing AIDS patients at the height of stigma. That legacy was unassailable, and every act by Camilla was judged against it. The Windsor corridor crystallized the gap between strategy and reality. Her words to George showed how brittle her charm could be when tested. It reminded me that charm works best on audiences at a distance, people who see only the smile, and hear only the rehearsed words. Within the palace where proximity reveals character, charm has less room to operate. George did not see a queen consort softening tensions. He saw a step-grandmother whose words cut at his sense of belonging. Ambition has always been part of Camilla's story, though she rarely admits it. Endurance itself requires ambition, the will to withstand decades of criticism, the determination to claim a place at Charles's side, the patience to outlast detractors. The Times once called her the monarchy's quiet anchor, but I saw her ambition more clearly, an instinct not just to survive, but to influence, to shape decisions, to secure her circle. The garage incident, the will drafts, the corridor confrontation with George all reflected ambition slipping past the boundaries of charm. What unsettled me most was how survival and ambition seemed to blur. Was she sharp with George because she wanted to assert authority, to remind him of hierarchy? Or was it the reflex of someone who had spent her life defending her place, unable to let even a child's presence shift the balance of attention either way? Survival had crossed into something harsher, and in that moment, the cost of her ambition became visible to all. International commentary echoed this paradox. Al Jazeera often described her as a queen consort defined by endurance rather than affection, while Deutsche Welle pointed out the fragility of her acceptance, noting that her influence was tolerated but not celebrated. These analyses matched what I had witnessed: a woman who had climbed to the highest position possible, but who still lived under the weight of scrutiny, mistrust, and Diana's unyielding shadow. In monarchy, survival matters, but survival without warmth breeds suspicion, and ambition without restraint breeds backlash. Camilla's charm had carried her through decades of storms, but Windsor showed its limits. It revealed that the persona she had crafted, compassionate, steady, unthreatening, was a mask that could slip with a single sentence. And once slipped, the survival it once secured became fragile, brittle, and exposed. I left Windsor convinced of one thing: Camilla's story is not one of triumph, but of endurance stretched thin. She had survived scandal, yes, but in that corridor with George retreating and William hardening, her survival looked less like victory and more like the final act of an ambition that had overreached, networks and countermoves. After Windsor, I began to notice how Camilla's network of allies moved swiftly, almost mechanically, to contain the damage. For decades, she had relied on a small but loyal circle of advisors, courtiers, and sympathetic journalists to shield her from scandal. They knew the choreography by heart, soften the headlines, flood the public with images of her smiling at charity events, and emphasize her role as Charles's steadying presence. This strategy had worked before transforming her from tabloid villain to queen consort. But now the fracture with William and George was too personal, too symbolic for the old routines to restore order. Within days, articles began appearing in the Telegraph and the Daily Mail framing Camilla as misunderstood, a grandmotherly figure unfairly maligned by rumor. BBC coverage emphasized her charity patronages, showing her laughing with children and embracing causes close to her heart. The goal was clear: redirect the narrative, drown suspicion in a tide of goodwill. Yet even as these stories circulated, the whispers inside the palace carried more weight. Staff who had witnessed the Windsor corridor incident remained shaken, their loyalty no longer automatic. Some confided quietly to reporters they trusted, adding fuel to speculation. Reuters noted the tension, carefully reporting renewed questions about Camilla's influence within the family. Al Jazeera was blunter, calling the incident a collision between legacy and ambition. Deutsche Welle placed it within a broader pattern, reminding readers that generational divides in Britain's monarchy were widening, with younger Britons far more skeptical of Camilla's presence. The more her advisors pushed soft focus narratives, the more the contrast with these hard analyses deepened. Inside the palace, counter moves grew desperate. Invitations to family events became carefully managed, ensuring Camilla was photographed beside Charles, never alone. When she appeared at charity engagements, her team ensured that cameras captured only the warmest moments. They even leaned on her old strategy of choosing safe, uncontroversial causes, hoping to remind the public of her steady ordinariness. But no amount of photographs could erase the fact that William no longer spoke to her. His silence was louder than any headline, and his distance signaled to staff where their loyalties should lie. Even Charles, though visibly supportive in public, seemed strained in private. He had long leaned on Camilla as his anchor, the one who calmed him in times of pressure. But now he was caught in a vice to side fully with her would risk alienating his son and grandchildren. To side with William would fracture his marriage and expose vulnerability. His indecision left a vacuum, and in that vacuum, Camilla's network faltered. Allies who once defended her with confidence now hesitated, sensing that her power was no longer assured. The PR campaign also ran into the reality of social media. Younger audiences were unmoved by staged photo opportunities. Clips of Diana resurfaced her walking through minefields, hugging AIDS patients, juxtaposed with speculation about Camilla's harsh words to George. Hashtags invoking Diana's name trended again, proof that the late princess still commanded more emotional authority than the living Queen Consort. For every smiling photograph of Camilla, there were thousands of reminders that her acceptance was conditional, fragile, and always under review. I realized then that networks built on narrative management are powerful, but brittle. They can soften perception, but they cannot erase truth. The Windsor incident was not just a moment, it was a symbol. It represented the line between endurance and overreach, between survival and ambition. And no advisor, however skilled, could spin away the sight of a child retreating in silence, or a father cutting ties to protect his son. In the end, Camilla's countermoves bought her time, but not trust. She remained in position, crown intact, her role beside Charles, undisturbed on paper. Yet beneath the surface, the currents had shifted. Her network was still there, but its confidence was shaken, its defenses less convincing. And for the first time since her rehabilitation began, I sensed that Camilla was no longer shaping the narrative she was reacting to. It isolated in the very palace she had once sought to anchor. Consequences and what remains. The reckoning at Windsor did not arrive with a public declaration, but with the quiet, relentless weight of silence. William ended all personal contact with Camilla. Invitations stopped. Conversations were rerouted through intermediaries. Even in the rare moments when they shared a space, the air was icy, every word measured, every gesture restrained. For a monarchy that thrives on ceremony and symbolic unity, the absence of warmth was itself a crisis. Camilla outwardly endured. She continued to appear at Charles's side, her posture impeccable, her smile unwavering. But inside the palace, her influence was visibly diminished. Staff no longer deferred to her as readily. Courtiers aligned themselves with William, Catherine, and their children, sensing that the future of the monarchy rested with them. Reuters reported on the consolidation of public trust around the younger generation, while the BBC described William and Catherine as the stabilizing face of the crown. By contrast, Camilla's presence was framed more as obligation than inspiration. The consequences went beyond perception. Her access to sensitive matters narrowed. No longer was she consulted on family financial decisions, inheritance discussions, or archival choices. Charles remained loyal in public, but in private he bowed to the reality that Camilla's judgment could not be allowed to outweigh his duty as king. The Guardian noted in an editorial that the monarchy had entered a new age of generational accountability, with William drawing firm boundaries his father had hesitated to set. Public sentiment hardened too. Polling from YouGov after the incident showed a widening generational gap. While older Britons still tolerated Camilla, younger demographics expressed growing distrust. Social media amplified the fracture, with Diana's legacy once again invoked as a moral benchmark. Al Jazeera framed it as a clash between memory and survival, while Deutsche Welle emphasized that no amount of rehabilitation could erase the enduring shadow of Diana. For William, the consequences were non-negotiable. Protecting George was paramount, not only as a father, but as a future king safeguarding his heir. His distance from Camilla sent a message that resonated far beyond Windsor. The monarchy's future would not be dictated by her presence. That truth, once unspoken, was now immovable. And yet Camilla endured in her own way. Endurance has always been her defining trait. She had survived scandal, vilification, and decades of hostility to claim the crown beside Charles. But Windsor showed the limits of endurance. She retained her title, yes, but stripped of trust and isolated in the very institution she had fought to inhabit. Endurance without influence is not power, it is survival in name only. What remains of her legacy then is paradox. She will be remembered as the woman who outlasted scandal, who stood by Charles until she became Queen Consort. But she will also be remembered for Windsor, for words spoken to a child that fractured the fragile unity of the family, for the silence that followed, for the isolation that no crown could disguise. For me, the lesson was stark. Monarchy is not only about ceremony or continuity, it is about trust. Once broken trust reshapes everything, altering relationships, reputations, and even history. Camilla's smile, her charm, her endurance, all could not bridge the chasm opened at Windsor. Diana's shadow endures, William's children embody it, and Camilla's attempt to navigate that shadow has defined her story. As I reflect, I return to that corridor where George stood with his book, small and unassuming, yet carrying the weight of a legacy larger than himself. In his silence, I saw the truth of the monarchy's future. It lies not in Camilla's survival, but in the resilience of the next generation, resilience rooted not in charm or ambition, but in love, memory, and integrity. That is what endures.